It's so wonderful to be here and to be here on this day and to be here in this moment. As I had a conversation with some of the folks yesterday evening, we find ourselves in a moment where the legacy and the work of Dr. King are under threat. And I think there are those who would seek to make Dr. King a version of himself that did not include the fullness of what he stood for, that did not include his ideas and his position as a political philosopher, as an intellectual, as somebody whose ideas, not only whose actions, but whose ideas and actions working alongside one another have shaped the way we understand this country and have shaped the trajectory we hope this country to be on. And part of what Dr. King thought a lot about, and not many people know, is he was deeply engaged in history. And in my work, I think a lot about the history of this country. I think a lot about how we remember this country, how we misremember some of this history of this country, and how that misremembering distorts our understanding of where we stand today. So in 2017, I watched several Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And as I watched those statues come down, I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority black city in which the majority of the statues of people held there were of enslavers rather than enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway? That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy? That my parents still live on a street today named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people? Because the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography, they're not just symbols, they're reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy, and public policy is what shapes the material conditions of people's lives, which doesn't just mean that if you take down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee, you suddenly erase the racial wealth gap, but it does help us understand that the ecosystem of ideas, stories, and narratives that we understand are shaped by the monuments, are shaped by the landscape of memory that are placed and created in these spaces. And so when I started thinking about my project, when I started thinking about this book that I've written, I was thinking a lot about, well, what are the places in this country that remember the history of slavery honestly and reckon with it honestly, and what are the places that fail to reckon with that history? And what are the places that are kind of doing something in between? And so I traveled all over the country to plantations, to monuments, to memorials, to museums, to prisons, to try to get an understanding of how the story of slavery was told. As I told the folks last night, one of the places I went was Monticello. And Monticello is a really interesting place because it is, as many of us know, the home of Thomas Jefferson, the intellectual founding father of this country, the third president of the United States. And Monticello is interesting because it's a sort of microcosm of the larger story of America. America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their ancestors could have never imagined. And it has done so at the expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of America. It's not just one over here and one over there. You can remember this one and talk about this one, but not talk about this one. You have to hold both of those realities at once. And that's something that Dr. King understood about this history. It's something he understood about America, is that you had to tell a story of America that encompassed the totality of what America was. And so many of us in this room understand that we can't think of America simply as the shining light on the hill. We understand that America is a complicated place, a place that is given so much and is also taken away a lot. And I think an honest, a robust, and empirically grounded understanding of this country demands that we hold the multiplicity and the variety and the complexity of this country alongside one another. And that's something that Dr. King demanded. He said in order to understand why the contemporary landscape of inequality looks the way that it does today, we have to understand the history that preceded it. We had to understand, at the top time that Dr. King was doing his work, we were only 100 years, less than 100 years removed from slavery, right? And so he was working when there were people in the civil rights movement who themselves lived through the period of enslavement. There was a proximity to that history. There remains a proximity to that history that we can't forget. One of the other places that I went, or rather, as I was thinking about Monticello, America serves as this microcosm. And Jefferson, I think, is somebody who embodies that cognitive dissonance. He is someone who wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, and wrote in notes on the state of Virginia that black people are inherently inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind. He said that the slave was incapable of love. He said that the slave was incapable of possessing or sustaining complex emotion. Wrote about Phyllis Wheatley, considered to be the sort of foremother of African-American letters, the first black woman to publish a book of poetry in the history of the United States. He said her work was below the dignity of criticism, that it wasn't even worth engaging with because he didn't believe that black people had the necessary intellectual acumen, the artistic capacity with which to create beautiful things. He's someone who wrote one of the most important documents in the history of the Western world and also enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children. So again, these are the sorts of things Dr. King recognized. These are the sorts of things that Dr. King was thinking about. He said, when we think about our founding, when we think about our history, we have to hold all of it together at once. One of the other places I went in the book was Angola Prison. Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It is 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It's a place where 75% of the people held there are black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences, and it is built on top of a former plantation. And it's interesting, you know, when I tell people I went to Germany about a year ago to write this story for the Atlantic magazine about how Germany memorializes the Holocaust. And I went to Germany, and I went to Dachau, the first prison that was built by the Nazis, or the first concentration camp that was built by the Nazis. And I stepped in the gates of Dachau, and it's this haunting, horrific expanse of vast, empty gray land. You look to your left, you see the remnants of the crematorium. You look to your right, you see the remnants of the barracks. And I just closed my eyes and I tried to do this thought exercise. I tried to imagine what it would be like if on that land they built a prison. And in that prison, the vast majority of the people held there were Jewish. And it was so abhorrent, it was so morally abhorrent, it was so deeply unsettling to even imagine that possibility that I couldn't finish the thought exercise as I stood on that land. And it's something that we would recognize as completely unacceptable. It's something that we would never accept given the history of what transpired on that land, and the idea that there would be such an institution on that land would simply be unthinkable. And yet here in the United States, we have the largest prison in the country, where the vast majority of people are black men serving life sentences, many of whom were sentenced as children, given that the United States is the only country in the world that sentences children to life without the possibility of parole. Many of whom were sentenced by non-unanimous juries, which has since been rendered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States for being an explicit vestige of white supremacy, who are working in fields, picking crops, while someone watches over them on horseback with a gun over their shoulder while they work for virtually no money. And so part of me is thinking about, when I go to a place like that, what is the failure of our collective memory? What is the failure of our collective understanding of our history that allows that prison to be built on that land, to be used in that way, where tens of thousands of black men are serving in a way that feels unsettlingly parallel to the history that preceded it? And at Angola, it's really fascinating. They have a gift shop. And at the Angola gift shop, you can buy coffee mugs and shot glasses and baseball caps and sweatshirts and t-shirts and stuffed animals dressed in prison paraphernalia. And on some of the t-shirts you can buy, there's a silhouette of a watchtower. And above and below the watchtower it reads, Angola, a gated community. As if to make a mockery of, to belittle the experiences of the thousands of people, the tens of thousands of people who have been held there, who are dying there, the tens of thousands of people over the course of so many decades, so many centuries. And I was there with a guy named Norris Henderson. Norris is a remarkable man. He served 30 years at Angola for a crime he did not commit, had been out for about 20 years, and leads the sort of prison reform movement in Louisiana and across the country, ensuring that formerly incarcerated people are part of the conversation about what it means to move away from mass incarceration. And I was with Norris, and we were on this bus, and we were leaving the prison, and in the distance we see these men who are working in the fields, and they lift their garden hose into the air and they dig them into the earth. They lift their spades into the air and dig them into the earth. And Norris looked at the men and he looked at me, and he opened his hands, and his hands had these calluses on them from all these years he spent working in the field. And he was like, Clint, I can't begin to explain to you what it felt like to pick cotton for 7 cents an hour, wondering if my ancestors picked cotton on this same land 200 years ago. So for the people who are incarcerated in Angola, this history is not an intellectual exercise. It's not a white paper. It's not a historical abstraction. This history is in their body. It's in their bones. It's in the calluses in their hands. And Angola is a place that clearly has failed to understand what its history, what its relationship to its history is, and as a result continues to perpetuate what the scholar Saidiya Hartman talks about as the afterlife of slavery, how the residue and the remnant of slavery continue to shape our social, political, and economic infrastructure in profound ways, and perhaps most directly and most evidently our carceral infrastructure. I end the book thinking about some time that I spent with my grandparents. My grandfather was born in 1930, Jim Crow, Mississippi. My grandmother born in 1939, Jim Crow, Florida. And I took them to the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., a remarkable museum. If you haven't had the opportunity to go there, you really should. And I was walking with my grandparents through this museum, and I was pushing my grandfather in his wheelchair. His cane is laid across his lap. My grandmother's walking a few paces ahead of us. And I have this moment where I'm watching them look at this museum. I'm watching them move through all of these exhibits. And I have this moment where I realize that so much of the history that is documented in this museum are things that they experienced firsthand. And when I talked to my grandmother afterwards, she had this refrain. She kept saying, "I lived it. I lived it. I lived it." And I think about how the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture is a woman named Ruth Bonner. And she rang the bell to sort of symbolically open the museum alongside the Obama family in 2016. And Ruth Bonner was the daughter of an enslaved person. Not the granddaughter, not the great-granddaughter, the woman who opened the National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2016 was the daughter of an enslaved person. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved. So when my 4-year-old and my 6-year-old sit on my grandfather's lap, I imagine my grandfather sitting on his grandfather's lap, and I'm reminded that this history we tell ourselves was a long time ago just wasn't that long ago at all. People want to talk about slavery as if it was something that happened in the Jurassic period, right? It was the dinosaurs, the Flintstones, and slavery all happening at the same time. But we know that that wasn't the case. There are people alive today who knew, who loved, who were raised by people who were born into chattel slavery. The idea that anyone would suggest that that history has nothing to do with the contemporary landscape of inequality, the idea that anyone would suggest that it has nothing to do with what our world looks like today, when we are only a few generations removed from a period of time where Black Americans were systemically prevented from having access to any notion of upward mobility, is revealed to be morally and intellectually disingenuous. It's further revealed, I think about a trip I took to England a little while ago. I was visiting England, and I got a tour of Oxford University. And so I'm on this tour of Oxford University, and the tour guide is showing us all these different buildings and explaining the history of this prestigious university. And he's saying, this famous poet wrote this poem in this building, and this famous scientist conducted this experiment in this building, and this famous philosopher wrote this treatise in this building. And he came to one building, and he looked at the building and looked at us, and looked at the building and looked at us. And he was like, this building was built around 1020. And in my head, I'm like, AM or PM, right? Like I couldn't even conceptualize the idea that a building that was still standing, that people were walking in and out of, had been built a millennium ago. But it's a reminder that the U.S.'s history is so young, it's so recent relative to the rest of the world. We're like the annoying preteen of the world. But in understanding that, and in understanding how recent the existence of our country is, it helps us understand how recent the history of slavery, the history of Jim Crow, and the contemporary manifestations of mass incarceration, how proximate we are to that history. And that's how it's so profoundly important for us to understand that this history, again, was not something that has nothing to do with what the contemporary landscape of inequality looks like, but has everything to do with what the contemporary landscape of inequality looks like. And when our teachers find ourselves, I was a former high school teacher in Prince George's County, Maryland, before I became a writer. And are there teachers in the building? Everybody give it up for the teachers. Our teachers find themselves in this moment where their work and their historical work and their work of helping our students understand the history of this country is under assault. We find ourselves in a moment where teachers attempting to teach the very history that explains why our society looks the way that it does today is rendered an ideological project rather than an empirical one, where people are attempting to prevent teachers and librarians from having access to books to provide to students that provide historical accounts and perspectives that these students might not otherwise encounter. And part of that is because if I remember when I was a kid growing up in New Orleans, and this is in the 80s and 90s, and I was inundated with these messages about all the things that were wrong with black people, that the reason there was so much crime, so much violence, so much poverty is because of black people, and that in order for us to move away from it, it had to be black people who had to fix something about ourselves. There was no analysis of structure. There was no analysis of systems. There was no context. There was no analysis of history. And so what happened is when you're a young person inundated with this information over and over again, when the world tells you over and over again that you are the problem, that your family is the problem, that your community is the problem, that people who look like you are the problem, if nobody is giving you the information with which to push back against that, you begin to internalize it. And I remember that moment. I remember that feeling. I remember being profoundly confused, where I kept hearing from the media, from politicians, right? And this is the peak of that discourse in the 90s, where people are saying that the problem existed within black communities. There was a problem of black culture. There was a problem of black families. And if nobody's giving you the language and the historical context with which to push back against that information, it can begin to feel like a weight. And I remember it wasn't until many years later when I read these books, when I saw these films, when I got exposed to scholars and journalists and writers who provided me with the language, with the toolkit, with the information with which to more fully understand that the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is not because of the people in those communities, but because of the things that have been done to those communities, the things that have been taken away from those communities, generation after generation after generation. That's when you begin to understand, oh, the reason that our world looks the way that it does today, the reason the society looks the way that it does today is not an accident. It's a direct result of public policy decisions that have been made by people who have attempted to prevent certain groups of people from having access to the levers of economic and political mobility. But what it also does, and what I tried to do in my classroom, is I tried to give this information to my students to help them understand this history, not so that they felt overwhelmed by it, not so that they felt weighed down by it, but to give them a sense of agency. Because when I got that information, that's what it did for me. It stripped me of a sort of social and intellectual paralysis. It freed me from this idea that the realities of my community were an inevitability, that they were static. And it helped me understand that the reason my community looked the way that it does was because of decisions that had been made. And once we understand that, we can understand that a different set of decisions can be made. We can understand that different policy can be enacted, that different political legislation can be passed. And so that was deeply important, and it's not a coincidence that we are in this moment where there is so much pushback, especially following the Black Lives Matter movement, the murder of George Floyd, in which there was a sort of unprecedented wave of people who were beginning to talk about America in more sophisticated, more complex, and necessarily fuller and more robust and more honest ways, that now there's an intense pushback to that discourse. The same thing that Dr. King experienced during the Civil Rights Movement, and the same thing that happened after the Civil Rights Movement, the same thing that happened after Reconstruction, right? Anytime there are moments of black progress, there are intense moments of pushback to try to label the discourse, to try to render that which is a fact, to render that which is empirical, as ideological, as dangerous, as something to be feared. But it's because so many people in this country have been told a very specific story about America. And now when we begin to tell a fuller story, a story that includes the perspectives of people whose ideas and perspectives haven't always been included, that can be a scary thing for a lot of people. It can create a sense, an existential crisis for a lot of people. And as a result, that's why state legislatures across the country are attempting to prevent teachers from teaching this history. And so what we need to do is make sure that we're empowering our educators, that we're being there for our educators, that we're being there for our students to help them understand all of these things that we know. in order to make sure that they have the tools, the skills, and the context with which to fully understand why our communities look the way that they do today. You know, people often ask me, they say, Clint, do you have hope about the direction that we're going? Do you have hope about, the trajectory of this country? And the way I think about that, I always think about how in 1619, the first black people who came to this country, came to the British colonies that would become this country in 1619. And slavery didn't formally end until 1865. But what's true is that from the moment enslaved people arrived on these shores, they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for liberation. They were fighting for emancipation. What that also means is that the vast majority of people who fought for freedom never got a chance to experience it for themselves. But they fought for it anyway, because they knew that someday someone would. And I think about what responsibility does that bestow upon me to try to build a sort of world that I might not see myself, but to build it because I know that somebody else down the line is going to benefit from it. Because that's the history that we're a part of. That's the ancestors that we come from. We come from a lineage of people who fought for freedom they knew they might never see, but who fought for it anyway because they knew that someday someone would. And so when I think about my life, when I think about my children's lives, when I think about our collective responsibility, I think about how it is our responsibility to attempt to build the sort of world that we might not see ourselves, that our children might not see themselves, that our grandchildren might not see themselves. But we have to work to build toward it anyway, because that's what people did for us. It's almost like there's a wall, and we're all chipping away at this wall. And you don't know if the wall is 6 inches thick or 6,000 miles thick. But you know the more you chip away at it, the less the people who come after you will have to chip away at. And that's our duty. That's our responsibility. Because if you don't chip away at that wall, you're just leaving more wall for the folks who come after you to chip away at. And one day, somebody's going to be chipping, and they're going to chip that final block. And there's going to be light on the other side. And that will only have been possible because of the generations of people who did it before them, who made it possible before them. And so in moments where it feels like no progress is being made, in moments where it feels like we're being pulled back, and in moments where it feels like we don't have a sense of if we're getting closer to all that Dr. King imagined, all that Dr. King hoped for, all that Dr. King worked for, that he died for. Part of what I think about is how Dr. King, and he said this in his speeches, he talked about the mountaintop and how he knew he wasn't going to get there with you, but he knew that you'd get there one day. But he knew that he had to climb. He had to work. He had to be the person shepherding us, and that we had to shepherd one another, and that it only happens if you put one foot in front of the other. It only happens if you keep chipping away at that wall, even when you don't know you're going to see the light. And I think that that is the thing that keeps me going in moments where I feel weighed down. That's the thing that keeps me going in moments that can feel overwhelming. I want to end, I'm a nonfiction writer. This book is a book of history, but I began my writing life as a poet. And for me, poetry is both the creation of art, but also the mechanism through which I do my best thinking. And when I was writing this book, How the Word is Passed, I was writing a lot of poems to figure out where I stood, to figure out what I was trying to say, what are the questions that I was trying to excavate and unearth. And so I wrote a range of different poems that helped give me clarity on that. And also what happens is when you're a poet writing nonfiction, sometimes you write a poem and you're like, oh, that's hot, I like that. And then you're like, let me change the stanzas into paragraphs, and you throw it in at the end of one of your chapters, and you hope your editor doesn't notice. So this is both a poem, but also an excerpt from my book, and I'll finish on this. Thank you all so much for having me. Growing up, the iconography of the Confederacy was an ever-present fixture of my daily life. Every day on the way to school, I passed a statue of P.G.T. Beauregard riding on horseback, his Confederate uniform slung over his shoulder, and his military cap pulled far down over his eyes. As a child, I did not know who P.G.T. Beauregard was. I did not know he was the man who ordered the first attack that opened the Civil War. I did not know he was one of the architects who designed the Confederate battle flag. I did not know he led an army predicated on maintaining the institution of slavery. What I knew is that he looked like so many of the other statues that ornamented the edges of this city, these copper garlands of a past that saw truth as something that should be buried underground and silenced by the soil. After the war, the sons and daughters of the Confederacy reshaped the contours of treason into something they could name as honorable. They called it the lost cause, and it crept its way into textbooks that attempted to cover up a crime that was still unfolding. They told us that Robert E. Lee was an honorable man, guilty of nothing but fighting for the state and the people that he loved, that the Southern flag was about heritage and remembering those slain fighting to preserve their way of life. But see, the thing about the lost cause is that it's only lost if you're not actually looking. The thing about heritage is that it's a word that also means I'm ignoring what we did to you. I was taught the Civil War wasn't about slavery, but I was never taught how the declarations of Confederate secession had the promise of human bondage carved into its stone. I was taught the war was about economics, but I was never taught that in 1860, the 4 million enslaved black people were worth more than every bank, factory, and railroad combined. I was taught the Civil War was about states' rights, but I was never taught how the Fugitive Slave Act could care less about a border and spell Georgia and Massachusetts the exact same way. It's easy to look at a flag and call it heritage when you don't see the black bodies buried behind it. It's easy to look at a statue and call it history when you ignore the laws written in its wake. I come from a city that is filled with statues of white men on pedestals and black children playing beneath them, where we played trumpets and trombones to drown out the Dixie song that still whistled in the wind. In New Orleans, there are over 100 schools, roads, and buildings named for Confederate soldiers or slaveholders. Every day, black children would walk into buildings named after people who never wanted them to be there. Every time I returned home, I would drive on streets named for those who didn't think of me as human, go straight for 2 miles on Robert E. Lee, take a left on Jefferson Davis, make the first right on Claiborne, translation, go straight for 2 miles on the general who slaughtered hundreds of black soldiers who were trying to surrender, take a left on the president of the Confederacy who made the torture of black bodies the cornerstone of his new nation, make the first right on the man who mounted the heads of rebelling slaves on stakes and spread them across the city in order to prevent the others from getting any ideas. What name is there for this sort of violence? What do you call it when the road you walk on is named for those who imagined you under a noose? What do you call it when the roof over your head is named after people who would have wanted the bricks to crush you? Thank you all.